Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the Social Science Research Council's 5th Centennial Lecture. I'm Anna Harvey, President of the Social Science Research Council, and we're here to celebrate the founding of the Social Science Research Council 100 years ago and the achievements of the social and behavioral sciences over the last 100 years. Each Centennial Lecture is given by a faculty member from one of the institutions in our college and university fund for the social sciences, and is focused on one of 10 important policy issues that represent the last 100 years of the Council's work. Our prior Centennial Lectures focused on immigration, social insurance, racial discrimination, and economic development, which were important research topics for the Council in the 1920s through the 1950s. This month, we're featuring the work of social scientists who supported the Green Revolution, which was central to the Council's work in the 1960s. So many of you know the story of the Green Revolution. In the 1960s, with hunger and malnutrition widespread in low-income countries, international agricultural research centers were established around the world to develop high-yield varieties of food crops, such as rice, wheat, and maize. And the large-scale crossbreeding initiatives launched by these research centers were remarkably successful, resulting in the development and release of high-yield varieties that are estimated to have increased crop yields by about 44% between 1965 and 2010. And so there's been some research recently that some of you may have seen estimating that delaying the Green Revolution by even just a decade would have cost an estimated $83 trillion, approximately 1 year of current global GDP. And had the Green Revolution never occurred, researchers estimated that GDP per capita in low and middle income countries would be only about 50% of what it is now. So the Green Revolution is widely celebrated for having enabled more food to be produced from the same amount of land, but less well known are the contributions of social and behavioral sciences to developing interventions that increase the adoption of productivity increasing agricultural technologies. In 1925, the Social Science Research Council established a Committee on Social and Economic Research in Agriculture, which provided over 100 fellowships to social and behavioral scientists to study take-up of agricultural innovations. Many of these SSRC fellows would later play important roles in the Green Revolution, including in devising and implementing strategies to support the adoption of high-yield crop varietals. In the decades since the 1960s, social and behavioral scientists have continued to make advances in identifying interventions that can increase the adoption of yield-enhancing agricultural technologies in areas where uptake remains low. So, for example, some research has shown that improving agricultural extension demonstration techniques in Ethiopia increased the likelihood that smallholder farmers would try a newly introduced and improved wheat variety. Connecting isolated farmers in Western Uganda to buyers who valued maize quality increased farm productivity and income. And in work in which today's speaker was a co-author, we learned that sharing information about new agricultural technologies with farmers who are central to social networks in Malawi increased the likelihood that other farmers would adopt these new techniques. So today we're very fortunate to have with us one of the country's leading researchers on technology adoption in agrarian societies, Mushfiq Mubarak from Yale University. Mushfiq is going to share with us insights from his path-breaking work, and I'm so happy to welcome him. Feel free to post questions in the Q&A as Mushfiq is talking, and I'll field them after he winds up, and we'll try to save about 15 minutes for Q&A. So Mushfiq, thanks so much for being here with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Anna Harvey, as well as SSRC. So I grew up in Bangladesh, and the Green Revolution was transformative for all of us. And so I'm very happy to have this opportunity to speak to you about research on agricultural technology adoption. So let me share my screen and get right into it. Screen two. Okay. And yeah, please do let me know if anything wrong with the audio or the screen sharing. Okay. So I chose a provocative version of the title, which is asking the question, why are we having trouble getting people to adopt products and behaviors and technologies that we think might be good for them, that can improve their welfare. And Green Revolution Technologies is a leading example of this, but it's not the only one. So I'd like to generalize the talk to what, through the work of social and behavioral scientists, we've learned about product adoption and behavior change. And while I'm doing the talk today, I'll be talking about many different research projects, and they are co-authored with many different people, and I'll try to point them out as they go along. Okay, so we have this a set of facts that motivates a lot of social behavioral science research, which is that there are these many examples of inexpensive welfare improving technologies that puzzlingly are not adopted by poor households in developing countries and agrarian societies. And these examples are in agriculture, but they also span health and finance and other sectors. So for example, malaria has been identified as a cause of low growth in sub-Saharan Africa since research in the 1990s. And there is a simple technology that lowers malaria transmission. It's insecticide-treated bednets, but there is a lot of work on trying to promote this new technology, insecticide-treated bednets, and even offering it at like 60, 70, 80% subsidies. And even then, adoption rates are far from universal. Right? New seed varieties, for example, Green Revolution technology is another leading example. So when I was growing up in Bangladesh, I remember food security was one of the key policy issues in the 1980s, right? We had like one TV channel that ran from 5 p.m. to 11 p.m. So I had no option as a kid but to watch the locally produced talk shows, the TV channel, and sometimes we would have experts coming in discussing food insecurity issues and the challenges the country faces. And the discussion would often be about, we have 100 million people we're struggling to feed. The population is projected to increase to 150 million in the next decade or two. How on earth would we feed all these people? And I'm happy to say that danger never came to pass, in that the population did increase to now closer to 170 million, but food security is not an object of concern. I mean, to be sure, the country has lots of other challenges. It's just food security is not one of them. And what happened is the Green Revolution, right? So you had this new varieties of seeds and other associated technologies that doubled or even tripled productivity in certain parts of the country. And that came from, multiple crop cycles. So you had varieties of seeds that could grow in the dry season, for example, right? And that was a quick way to increase productivity, right? Now, the puzzle is, why are we still talking about it if that was such a big success? It's because of some of the numbers that Dr. Harvey quoted earlier, which is that if we could have sped up the diffusion process for the Green Revolution, even by 10 or 20 years, that would have had an enormous consequence on the country's productivity and people's welfare, right? And so we want to understand, why is it that even though the technology proved to be so profitable, where it doubled or tripled productivity, why did it take 30, 40 years to fully take hold, right? So we'll talk a lot about that today. Okay. Other simple examples in health, like improved cook stoves. So acute respiratory infections, the WHO claims, is the leading cause of under 5 mortality and female morbidity. And there are these stoves that are cleaner burning that are available, right? Not just gas and electric stove, but also just stoves that are redesigned to not produce as much particulate matter, right? And that's been a leading cause. The inhalation of particulate matter has been a leading cause of mortality. But then when I've done representative surveys all across Bangladesh, the market penetration of like non-traditional stove varieties is actually close to nil, right? So we want to understand, why is it that people are exposing themselves to indoor air pollution and not switching the technology that might actually make their and their children's health better off, right? Another example that I'd like to spend a little bit of time discussing today is a migration, in the sense that there are, even in Bangladesh, even with all of the growth, we still have periods of seasonal deprivation in North Bengal. And this is same is true in Eastern Indonesia. It's in Nepal. It's true in Sub-Saharan Africa, where it's sometimes called the hungry season. So there's deprivation between planting and harvest. And then the question is, why do people stick around there? Why don't more people migrate out? And that's another way, by spatially diversifying, you could address challenges in agrarian societies. So we'll talk about that a little bit today, right? Another example from finance is, in rainfall insurance. So there are numbers that suggest that about 80% of inter-annual variability in livelihoods across India, in rural India, is coming from variation in weather, right? So whether the rainfall arrives on time, more importantly, whether the second rainfall arrives on time after you plant the seeds, right? The timing as well as the quantity of rainfall, etc. Right? So you'd think that farmers would be desperate for and really eager to adopt rainfall insurance. So in the sense that, if you and I had a event that affected 80% of our livelihood, we would definitely want to insure against that, right? I mean, we actually buy insurance for things that don't affect our lives that much, things like car accidents, right? But in spite of that, it's, the market penetration of insurance products, weather insurance products, is surprisingly low in agrarian societies, right? So that's another puzzle that we'd like to think through. And staying in India, another puzzle for the last couple of decades has been this problem of open defecation, which is a massive public health threat, in that until recently, about half of all rural Indians, so close to 500 million people, were still going out in the open, and that's a public health threat. So why don't people use a technology that we all understand well, toilets, right, to address that problem, right? And then during the pandemic, we saw that there are many, many other examples that come up organically in the middle of a crisis. So early in the pandemic, scientists recognized that masking would be very useful in order to prevent disease transmission. And early in the pandemic, we had data from countries where masking norms were more common, like countries in East Asia, right, where the virus was not moving in the same speed as it was in other countries. But then we went back to the same problem of how do you encourage mask wearing? How do you encourage this new type of behavior, right? And it turned out social norms matter a lot for that behavior. Similarly, since in the second half of the pandemic in 2021, 2022, we now have the problem of encouraging vaccine, like in the case of COVID, it would be taking a COVID vaccine. But generally, we also have the problem of how do you encourage parents to ensure that their children have all the required vaccinations. Okay? So when we ask these questions as to why people aren't adopting technologies that we think are good for them, right? The set of answers, the two answers that you get most often is one is a lack of information or lack of reliable information that you can trust, right? And the second one is some form of lack of money, right? And the lack of money is sometimes it's a liquidity constraint, but of course you also, for an economist, you'd also have to think carefully about if people don't have the money, why don't they borrow money to invest in a product that is going to make them better off, right? So if indeed a bed net or a stove makes you much healthier, right, it allows you to avoid healthcare costs, right? It also makes you more productive because you're not missing as many days being sick, right? Then these technologies should pay for themselves. And if that's true, then even if people don't have the money, they should be willing to borrow money to invest in the product and then generate the returns from being healthier, right? And that itself pays for the product. Or you could also think about not just a credit market solution, but it could also be a savings-based solution, which is you don't have money, but you should be able to save up. You should be willing to save up for it, right? So then to understand the money issues, we'd have to think through savings constraints, credit market constraints, as well as liquidity constraints, right? And then beyond information and money, the two most commonly cited sources of why people are averse to new technologies. There's also issues of intra-household divergence in preferences. So in the stove case, for example, our research in our research, we find that women who cook, who are bearing the brunt of the indoor air pollution, they're actually much more eager to invest in improved cook stoves, cleaner burning cook stoves, but they often don't hold the purse strings, right? And so the decision appears puzzling when you think about why the household isn't adopting, but it's less puzzling when you think about who within the household makes that decision, right? Something else we'll talk about is risk aversion. So basically, if I'm down to my last $50 and I'm unsure about whether a new behavior or product or technology would work, right? Then I might not be very willing to spend my hard-earned money to invest in a product, even if I believe it to to be good for my family in expectation, just because it's a risky endeavor, right? And then you can also have situations where there's some traditional way of doing things that crowds out the new market. So just as an example, going back to rainfall insurance, right? One reason why people may not be willing to buy formal insurance is that they are already informally insured through their networks, right? So with the lack of formal insurance market, so there's informal networks that appear. There's large literatures on this in development economics, where people have tried to study this, the format of sort of informal risk sharing, right? And so essentially, for example, in India, the way it would work is that you are born into a caste and a subcaste, a jati, and that's your network, right? And there's an understanding that people in the same jati help each other out, right? In one year, if I'm going through a bad time, you'd help me out, with the understanding in a different year, I would help you out, right? So now people are already informally insured. And so in a setting like that, if you try to introduce a new formal market and a formal product like rainfall insurance, right? The reaction may be, look, I'm already sort of paying for this insurance by virtue of being part of this network. So even if you're offering me an actually fair contract, that price may not be fair for me, right? Because I'll have to continue helping other people out. Okay, and then social norms matter a lot. So basically, for example, whether or not I am willing to mask up depends on whether people around me are masking or not, right? So if you think back to, like, say, early 2020, say March of 2020, at the onset of the pandemic, if you, in where I live now in New Haven, if I was walking around with a mask, people would look at me funny, saying, what is wrong with this guy? Why is he masked? Is he sick? Whereas in exactly a year later, in March 2021, if I was walking around without a mask, people would look at me funny. So in that case, social norms change very, very quickly. And then sometimes we have to admit to the fact that, maybe just the technology just doesn't work as well as we think it does in the lab, right? So as a simple example, with the cook stoves, I've worked with engineers who've been working on the problem of like designing cleaner burning stoves, right? And they are really focused on the public health aspects of the technology, meaning is the combustion more complete? Does it produce less particulate matter, etc., right? But sometimes that new stove might change the taste of the food, right? And so for the user, what matters is whether or not, say, her husband would like the taste of the food. And if not, that might cause a lot of problems in her family, right? And so in designing the technology, sometimes we are focused on the right thing from our perspective, which is public health gains or the engineering gains, right? But it may not be what the user cares about, right? So there's also sometimes design issues that we might have to address. Okay, so that's a very quick tour of a very large amount of literature that dozens, maybe hundreds of people have contributed to, many economists, but also sociologists, psychologists, and others, right? And let me now try to give you a sense of how, the economists, we conduct research on these topics, and then give you just a few examples. Okay, so the research approach that we've taken in development economics is to run randomized controlled trials where we might market that new product or behavior to a few thousand people. And often these trials are conducted in developing countries where we want to understand this behavior, right? And we, apart from the few thousand, beneficiaries or participants in the trial that we might have, the other component of this, the other characteristic of this trial is that we will be randomly varying different aspects of that marketing strategy to understand what works best. And hopefully we design it well enough such that we understand the underlying behavioral model, right? What was preventing people from investing in that new product or behavior or technology to begin with. Basically, that's the approach. And all of the studies that I will give you as examples today will have some sort of feature like that, or some randomization, and then some random variation in this first stage marketing. Okay. All right, and I'll just put up, all of the various things I've been working on, because in the Q&A period, we don't only have to talk about the examples I have time to give you today. I'm happy to talk about cook stoves, migration, rainfall insurance, toilets, both in rural and in urban areas. I'm happy to talk about agricultural technologies as well as public health behaviors. I definitely won't have time to go through everything during the 40-minute portion of my talk. Okay. So I'll just leave this up for just a second. So please, think about what questions you want to ask or what topics you want to discuss. Okay. So with that, let me jump into the topic of agricultural technologies, because I wanted to stay with the SSRC theme that's going decade by decade. And I want to stay with the theme of green revolution and agricultural technologies. Okay. So this is a graph from the World Development Report of 2004, which was on agriculture, that has motivated some of my research that I'm about to tell you. Okay. So what I like about this graph is essentially like the green line that you see is for Asia, but it looks just like that for every continent essentially except for Africa, every inhabited continent except for Africa, right? Which is that over time, right? What this graph shows you is that over time, we keep getting more and more food by not having to allocate any more land to food production, right? And in fact, in North and South America, like in Brazil, for example, and the United States and Canada, this green line is actually backward bending. So not only is it just shoot straight up, right? It goes backward, which says that we actually get more in later years, we get more food out of allocating even less land to agriculture, right? And Africa is the only exception. It's a continent where the only way we've been getting more food is by allocating more and more land to agriculture, okay? So why is that happening? So this is linked to productivity, right? So in every other continent, there's been steady growth in yields per hectare. But in Africa for the last 40 years, 1960s all the way to this century, it's, the year of the World Bank report in 2004, 2005, it's remained, the yields have remained very flat, okay? And so why are yields flat? It's been a story of technology adoption or the lack of technology adoption in Africa. So if you see, this is all from the same World Bank World Development Report, you see the use of irrigation is a lot lower in Africa than in the rest of the world. You see the use of non-traditional improved seed varieties a lot lower compared to the rest of the world. Fertilizer use is a lot lower compared to the rest of the world, right? So then that moves us to the question of why is technology adoption so much lower on this one continent, okay? So then I'll go back to, the framework that I started out with, right? Which is that, there, of course, when we are talking about agricultural technology adoption, we do have to worry about, maybe people don't have the money to buy seeds. That's the liquidity constraint, right? People may also be risk averse, which is that my ancestors have all been planting this in this particular way. We've survived. Now, if you bring a new seed variety or some other agricultural technique to me and it doesn't work out, there's some risk that even if you're telling me that at your Erie lab in Manila, it worked well, right? But you bring it to me and given my soil conditions, my farming techniques, it doesn't work, right? And there's a crop failure, I cannot take that chance. And that would be this risk aversion story. But beyond that, what I'd like to chat a little bit about with you today with a couple of papers is not, there's been a lot of research on risk aversion and credit constraints, but I'd like to talk about information constraints, okay? And so what are the potential information failures or market failures in the market for information that can explain why technology adoption rates are so low? One simple story is that many rural farmers just don't know about the existence of a new technology or they don't know how to use it, right? And they just need to be taught about the existence or the use of the technology, right? Then there's also a question of credibility, right? Do they believe the official message about the benefits of the new technology? And third, they need to be persuaded to adopt, right? So that risk aversion story I was telling is also, there's one way to get around it, which is that we need to be convincing and persuasive in telling the farmer, yes, if you adopt, it is very, very likely to work out for you, right? And you shouldn't worry about that. And so in that case, if that's true, then maybe the proximity of the information source of their credibility might matter. So in the following sense, that if an expert is coming from the city and telling me this is a very nice new seed variety that would, in expectation, improve productivity, I may not believe the message, or I may not trust the message because they haven't tried it out on their own, on a farm that looks like mine, given my agricultural inputs, access, given my soil quality, etc. Whereas if my neighbor who has the exact same soil quality as me and who may have similar access to inputs as me, if they try it out and it works out for them, that same information may be received very differently, because now that's much more credible because the source is so much more proximate, right? And the information is a lot more relevant. Okay, so given these issues, so there has been, of course, the issue of information failures have been long recognized. So even back in the over 100 years ago, the United States had big agricultural extension system, right? Like connected to the land grant universities, for example, right? And since then, many or pretty much all countries within the Ministry of Agriculture, there is a Department of Agricultural Extension, where the job is that they might take new technologies that the Department of Agricultural Research Services are working on, and their job is to take those new technologies and figure out how do we disseminate that information to farmers, right? So there's this extension system. Now, the primary way of engaging extension workers have been to hire sort of university graduates who act as extension workers, who are given the job, the responsibility as civil servants to go talk to farmers, right? Now, a puzzling aspect of taking that approach is that we have 50 years of research now, starting in both sociology and economics, like Everett Rogers' work or Zvi Grilikis' work from the 1950s, right? That suggests that social learning is extremely important, and it's an important vector by which information gets transmitted from one farmer to another, right? So we started about a dozen years ago, about maybe more than that, 2008, 2009, we started experimenting with first with the Ministry of Agriculture in Malawi, and then we expanded to other ministries around the world on how do we effectively incorporate social learning and social network-based transmission into the extension services. Okay? So let me jump to our first iteration of the experiments that we ran. So this is in Malawi, and we worked across 8 districts all over the country that the ministry chose, right? And we first worked with the Department of Agricultural Research and identified, what are the new technologies that they would like to disseminate, right? And that they feel convinced about and they think farmers should know about, right? So we first identified the technology, and then we worked with them to change the dissemination method, in the sense that in one arm, right, we did have the status quo, which is let's work through the extension worker. In the Malawi context, that's the Agricultural Extension Development Officer, IDO, right? And so that was, in some sense, our control arm, like the status quo arm, right? And then what we did in the other arms was to say to the extension agent assigned to that village that beyond maybe what you should do is identify in one randomly chosen set of villages, identify a lead farmer who would be particularly good at taking on the technology, and then make sure that he understands and knows the technology, and give him or her, often him, but him or her, the responsibility to teach others, right? So use this lead farmer model as kind of your partner model in order to get information about the technology out of this village. Okay? Now, the problem with the lead farmer model is that the lead farmer is often atypical, right? It's a person who often tries out the technology first, right? Is most eager to adopt, or has the access to the inputs that allows him or her to experiment, right? But because they're atypical, for the reasons I was giving earlier, they may not be particularly persuasive to other farmers, right? In the sense that if something works for the lead farmer, right, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's relevant for me, because he has access to inputs that I don't, right? And so in a third set of villages randomly assigned, right, we told the extension worker, trained the extension worker on the new technologies, but asked him to identify what we call peer farmers. So instead of atypical lead farmers, just pick sort of average looking farmers, right? And use them as your extension partner. Like make sure they understand the technology and give them the responsibility of teaching others. Right? And the idea is that maybe, their relevance and credibility and proximity will matter, right? So we wanted to put these three in a horse race. Now, we did a cross-cutting experiment where we said half of all the communicators, we are going to provide some performance-based incentives, meaning a year later, if I see it, I'm going to go back and test what farmers know, and 2 years later, I'll actually go back and look for actual adoption. And if I see 20 percentage point increases in knowledge or adoption, then you will get a performance-based incentives. And we try to make sure that the value of the incentives was basically similar across all three arms. And then we also have a pure control group where we're not talking about the technology at all. We just wanted to track what happens to technology and agricultural productivity in those areas, right? Okay, so the way to think about the project is that from that sociology, economics, and even computer science literature, we know that there's a lot of passive social learning, right? And what we're trying to do in this project is partnering with the Ministry of Agriculture to see if and how we can activate that social learning. So a quick note about the two technologies. So pit planting, it's a very arid country, so you dig pits and that retains the soil moisture better. That was a technology that was popular in West Africa, and we're trying to bring it to Malawi, right? And then the other issue is, other thing we wanted to do is a particular type of composting that they call Chinese composting, which is about, like creating these compost heaps in your house using, food scraps, etc., and then transporting it to your field and using it alongside the chemical fertilizer program that the government has. And so this already tells you exactly, why the lead farm, why relevance of the technology or information source might matter. So, for example, the lead farmer might have access to an ox cart, so you can transport the compost, right? But a regular farmer may not. So even if the technology is sensible for a lead farmer to adopt, it may not be sensible for the average, much more constrained farmer. Okay. So let me just summarize what we see. Okay. So the first thing is that, remember, we have two arms for all communicators with and without incentives. Okay. So if you look at these peer farmers and you don't provide them any incentive, okay, they don't bother learning about the technology themselves. They don't put any effort. We track all of this carefully for the next 2 years. They don't put in much effort communicating with others. They don't hold events. Others are no more likely to report that they've had conversations with these communicators, etc. So others don't adopt, and basically the technology dies out in those villages. And after 2 years, they look pretty indistinguishable statistically from the pure control villages where we never even mention the technology. Okay? So it was a complete failure, absent incentives. But then when we add incentives, and the incentive was actually quite small per peer farmer, it was just a bag of legume seeds, right? That strategy jumps from the worst to the best. Okay? So in those 2 years, we see an 11.5 percentage point increase in pit planting from essentially zero in those villages because it was a new technology. And then for the Chinese composting, we actually see a 27 percentage point increase in composting, but it didn't start off at zero, right? And we can then track, because there was a change in behavior, we can track effects on yields, which we do. And we see also significant gains in yields, right? And that makes that communication strategy, including the monitoring for the incentives, that makes it quite cost effective. Okay? So in this case, what we end up learning is that, when you try to activate that passive social learning, right, incentives do matter. So it's not, the models that we had where people sort of automatically learn from others. Like I know something and automatically with some probability that gets transmitted to my neighbors. Those models are probably missing something. We do need to understand these communication dynamics better. And in particular, what incentives do people have to communicate to others and to teach others? And so when we try to activate social learning and turn this like social network into a policy tool, you do have to think about those types of incentives for communication. Okay. All right, so let me jump to another paper from the same setting. So we did another cross-cutting experiment where, given that most of the lead farmers were men, right, we also introduced this idea that can we go to some villages and encourage them to choose women, right, as their communicators, either lead or peer farmers, right? So then we have this random variation where in some villages we have female communicators, okay? And basically you're giving them two tasks. So one is, the communicator, like peer or lead farmer, we're asking them to learn about the technology themselves and apply it themselves on their own farm, right? And then the second task, task B, is to convince other people in their village to adopt, okay? What we end up finding in that study is that male versus female communicators are both just as good at learning about the technology. The female communicators are not any worse at learning about and applying the technology in their own field productively, right? However, when we think about the outcome variables, which involve the communicator convincing, persuading others to adopt, that's where we see that women do relatively poorly, right? So, and there's evidence in the data that others seem to pay less attention to women. Others perceive women to be less knowledgeable about farming, right? And it's not just that male farmers are not willing to listen to women. We also see that other female recipients of the information also are equally discriminatory against female communicators, right? So it seems like identity matters. Work by George Akerlof and Rachel Cranton on identity, and providing agricultural advice doesn't seem to be a female identity in that context. Okay. So overall, this agenda was teaching us that we should find some cheap ways to leverage this freely available social learning that's already happening. People are talking to each other, and maybe we can leverage it, turn it into a policy tool to improve agricultural extension services beyond the status quo of just sending agricultural extension agents out, because these extension agents, they're university graduates. They're actually not particularly eager to go spend a lot of time in remote rural areas. So you end up seeing that a lot of the extension positions, about half the positions, are actually unfilled in the Malawi Ministry of Agriculture at that time, even though it's a country with high unemployment rate. Right. And even when the positions are filled, the agents don't spend a lot of time in the village, so people don't have much contact with them. Right. Whereas with social network, you can lower the price of communicating with a recipient farmer, because you're giving the responsibility to somebody who already is in the village, and so for them it's a lot lower cost to be there and talk to other people. But we also learned that incentives matter. So you can't just teach them and say, please do it and leave, right? When you activate social learning, the information transmission is not automatic, and we need to understand incentives to communicate, right? So then, something that we wanted to experiment more with is that when we see that incentives matter, but these are performance-based incentives, which are actually quite expensive to implement, not because the incentives are expensive. They're not. The incentives can be very small. It's not the cost of the incentive. It's because the monitoring that's required for you to go and check whether or not there was that 20 percentage point increase in adoption, right? If you could eliminate that and just give people a gift and hopefully rely on reciprocity or gift exchange, right, then we would be able to lower the cost of this type of an intervention. Okay. And so we also thought that for external validity, we also need to understand the diffusion process. How do people learn? So we jumped into another project where we now, same context, same technology in Malawi, we're working with pit planting, but we go back to the sociology literature. So for example, threshold models in the sociology literature, and two versions of the model. One is simple contagion, where simple contagion is like viral transmission, right? Basically, if the simple contagion model would be, if I am connected to one person who uses the technology, then I will get infected with it, right? Whereas complex contagion would mean I would need to hear about the technology from multiple people before I am persuaded to adopt. Okay? So we wanted to test out which of these models is correct, and the way we end up doing it is we basically collect social network data in the village, right? And then run simulations on that data to identify who would be the theoretically optimal communicator if simple contagion is the right view of the world, and who would be the theoretically optimal communicator if complex contagion is the right view of the world, right? And so we have these theories that we can now randomly assign to villages, right? And that's how we set up the communication strategies, right? So basically, the first step is you figure out the network pattern in the village, like who's connected to whom. And then you can run simulations on this data to say, okay, look, if I have a budget of seeding the technology to 2 people, right? Who should those 2 people be? And the different theories give you 2 different optimal 2 people. Okay? And what we end up learning from this research is that the data, which is on the right-hand side here, looks a lot like the actual data, looks a lot like the simulations that come out of the assumptions that the world is complex, as opposed to the world being characterized by simple contagion. So complex contagion essentially does best. It outperforms simple contagion, but it also outperforms a benchmark, the status quo benchmark that we use, which is allowing the extension agent to choose the two people to seed the technology to who they think would be best able to do this, right? And it's actually quite remarkable that the theory, complex contagion theory, outperforms it because, of course, the extension agent could choose two people on the basis of like how friendly they are, how outgoing they are, how handsome they are, or whatever it is, right? Things that matter for technology adoption, which of course our theories cannot, and even then, the theory seems to outperform. Okay, so the implication here is we'd like to figure out next, it's a very data-intensive process to construct all those network maps. Of course, at scale, we couldn't, we can't expect people to, the ministries of agriculture to undertake that big task, right? But can we come up with simpler methods that can approximate the benefits of complex contagion? And that's what we've been working on through simulations. Okay, so I'm almost out of time. So let me end my 40 minutes talking about what is the next thing for us to do, right? What's become important. And so here I want to turn my attention to climate change. Okay. Now, so new technologies, behaviors have to be adopted for the purposes of adaptation to climate change. And here we started working in southern Bangladesh. The coastal areas of Bangladesh has already seen the effects of climate change in that there's been a lot more water intrusion. And when there's water intrusion, this leads to increased salinity level, both in the water as well as the soil, right? So if you look at, the boundaries of salinity have been creeping up and up over time. So there's been creeping increases in sea level rise of like 7-8 millimeters per year, right? And as it keeps creeping up, it changes the salinity level, both in the groundwater, surface water, as well as the soil, right? And of course, it's not surprising to anyone that rice doesn't like salt water, right? So this is creating a drop in agricultural productivity, in rice productivity, right? So one part of adaptation may be going back to the Green Revolution, new technologies, right? Where you have more salt resilient rice varieties. But even those rice varieties that IRRI or Bangladesh Rice Research Institute have come up with, they do well up to a certain level of salinity, but with climate change, we're seeing salinity levels exceeding what even these rice varieties can handle, right? So farmers would engage in other forms of adaptation, which we've been trying to track. And so here's what rice farms look like in that region, before. And here's what a lot of the farms look like now. Okay. What's going on is shrimp farming. So people are switching away from rice farming to shrimp farming as rice productivity drops, because it turns out when the water gets salty, while rice doesn't like salt water, shrimp, they don't mind as much, right? So then, that type of adaptation is happening. So we need to understand both the constraints to that form of adaptation and potential externality costs, because once you actually start doing a lot of aquaculture, right, it hastens the process, it speeds up the process of salinification. Okay? So what are some of the constraints here? So one is the minimum efficient scale of a shrimp farm is actually much larger than the small rice farm we have in South Asia, right? So this means that somehow we have to think about the process of land consolidation. So this is not, I wanted to give you this example because it's not just an individual specific issue. It's also sometimes a systemic issue or a community-wide issue where we have to think about the constraints being imposed by the community, right? It depends on whether or not I can actually get together with my neighbors and come up with a joint shrimp farm, right? That requires us to co-invest and then figure out how to divide up the resources, right? And another area that's going to be that's going to be an issue is that this is going to increase migration pressures. And the reason is shrimp farming is not nearly as labor intensive as rice farming is, right? So you might expect labor demand to fall. And if labor demand falls, then that's going to increase migration pressures. We already have a lot of internal migration that happens in Bangladesh. A lot of that migration is likely to be internal, not international. And so that's an area that I have been working on, anyway in Bangladesh. So it turns out in other parts of the country, there's this lean periods where food insecurity goes up, like people have worried about having enough food. And we've been trying to encourage migration in those areas by providing bus tickets and essentially transport subsidy. But since I'm out of time, let me stop there. And in the Q&A, if you want to hear more about migration, I'm happy to talk about it. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Mushfiq. Super interesting. We have a bunch of questions here, so I'm going to just start going through them. So one of the questions from really the top of the presentation about the more of the continent level differences in adoption of agricultural technologies. One of the questions is, could the low adoption or the flatline rate of adoption in sub-Saharan Africa be in part related to the relative abundance of land, so that the strategy, an optimal strategy might be to spread out instead of trying to increase productivity in the same amount of land?
For sure that matters, because land pressures are an important determinant of how people would react, right? But what's been going on in Africa is, as you're trying to move to new areas, right? We are moving into more and more marginal land, right? And there's, of course, also environmental ramifications of that. If we are able to generate the amount of food that we need to produce, but do it in a smaller amount of land, then that could also have an effect on land use. So, for example, I'll just quickly tell you some results from Brazil. So with positive shocks to agricultural productivity between 1950 and 2000, what you observe is that when there's agricultural productivity goes up, people switch into more cropping and actually less and divert land away from cattle grazing, right? Which is a much more land-intensive activity. And we indirectly see that leads to lower deforestation, right? Because with increases in agricultural productivity, then people can grow more within the same plot of land. And it indirectly, it's like an unintended consequence, or a positive unintended consequence, that it benefits the forest. So it's a complex question.
Yeah. So here's a question about whether some of the insights that you're learning from working in these lower income countries are any of them useful for higher income countries too, where we have plenty of problems with also different kinds of problems, but also problems with adoption of effective technologies, including vaccination, but also climate mitigation kinds of strategies. So is it something that you've thought about?
Yeah. So let me give you both positive and negative examples, right? So the positive example, I think the clearest one for the last 2 years has been masks. So we needed research done, we needed evidence on whether masks work and how to get people to wear masks. And it turns out the only large-scale randomized controlled trial was done in Bangladesh. So we learned a lot about, and in fact, the New York Times and Washington Post broke that story, right? So there are cases where there's a direct learning, right? But like the negative example also from the pandemic period is that if you look at vaccine research, right, which has become a lot more common since 2021, when we're trying to figure out, okay, how do we get people to take the COVID-19 vaccine, right? The vast majority of that research focuses on things like misinformation, disinformation, etc., right? Vaccine hesitancy. But it turns out that's not really the problem in developing countries at all. People are not deeply vaccine hesitant. The primary problem there is access, like especially in remote rural areas. So if you want to get, Africa remains largely unvaccinated. If you want to get from 0 to 50, right? You really just need to get people access to vaccines. In Sierra Leone, the average Sierra Leonean, it takes them 3.5 hours each way to get to the nearest vaccination center, right? But we've been focused a lot more on the misinformation and hesitancy research, because that's the American problem, where you have, if you want to go from 75 to 100, that's what you need to work on, right? So sometimes it fits well, and sometimes, it moves us in the wrong direction.
Yeah. Kind of related to that is the question of, there was an article in the New York Times, maybe it was about a month ago, about decarb bros, but just the idea that we're going to be able to solve climate change mitigation with technology alone, that we don't need to think about behavior and choices and decision making. And one of the things, you talked about climate adaptation, thinking about changing behaviors around emissions reduction, is it qualitatively different from some of the examples that you've been giving? Because most of the examples you gave us and you've been thinking about involve technologies that actually have a return to the individual. And so the puzzle is, well, why isn't the individual adopting that given the health or financial return to the individual? But adopting something like, climate mitigation behaviors, including emissions reductions, those don't necessarily have an individual financial. And so will they require like a completely different set of strategies, do you think?
Absolutely. And this is a good place for me to point out that, we've been talking a lot about sort of individual behavioral issues and techniques, right? But there might also be systemic issues, right? And we shouldn't forget that some of the solutions may, for some of these problems may be system-wide solutions as opposed to like encouraging individual behavior, right? So just as a simple example, like to get people to wear masks or to get people to use toilets rather than defecate in the open, the right solution may not be, how do we incentivize adoption at the individual level? The right solution might be that we have to pass a law, right? To get the behavior that is better for public health. And you're absolutely right that when there are behaviors with externalities, right, that's when there may be room and need for government intervention of that form or systemic intervention of that form. In fact, I'd go farther and say that, in the small example I briefly gave about improved cook stoves, right? Here, there's an externality, and that externality happens to be within the household, right? So the individual, say the husband who is holding the purse string and deciding what to spend money on, may not be adequately accounting for the costs and benefits accruing to his wife, right, who has to like breathe in the smoke from the traditional stove. And even there's room for public intervention.
Yeah. So we have a few questions here that ask a version of the same question, which is, isn't this approach, the general approach of trying to figure out how to increase technology adoption in lower income countries, including agrarian societies, isn't this, does it have the risk of being paternalistic or excessively technocratic, like we know best, and our job is to figure out how to get these individuals in these communities to change their practices? You probably get some version of this, and I'm curious if you've thought about how you'd answer that kind of question.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a risk. Like, because sometimes as I was, that's why I alluded to the example that and had as one of my bullet points. Sometimes the technology is just not appropriate, right? Like we think it's appropriate based on our laboratory work, right? The technology works well in the lab, right? The engineers or the public health professional, they get really excited about it, but it just may not be either relevant or correct because we are not thinking through costs and benefits correctly, right? Now, and therefore it's also important, there's another aspect of paternalism, right? Like for us to make the claim that, look, by running an intervention, we have a chance to improve matters, right? We actually have to then carefully identify, okay, why is the current solution being practiced not the right one? So in economics parlance, that would mean that we really do need to identify the market failure, right? Otherwise, maybe people are making the right choices, and by implementing a non-standard or non-traditional solution, we might actually distorting decisions, right? So we really do need to, that's why economic theory remains extremely important, right? In thinking through all of this. And there is, of course, this is not a competition between economics and other social sciences, right? There is value to all different types of research here, including ethnographic research. And so, for example, we may not, by implementing systemic solutions, even if it's done in partnership with the Ministry of Agriculture or Ministry of Health, right? We may not be getting all of the right sources of information. I have, when I was trying to when I was originally designing the cook stove work, right? The first step was, okay, let's, figure out what the international research says, right? And there were gaps there. We then went to Dhaka and figured out, okay, people who've been working in this sector, say at BRAC and the government, right? What do they know? What do they say, right? There's some gaps there. doing focus groups, right? Prior to design, this is all prior to designing any kind of trial, right? Doing focus groups, did that too. And there's still gaps there because, you don't necessarily get a representative view, right, in a group setting. And then just spending a lot of time in the kitchen with a woman as she does the cooking, and then figuring out that at the same time that she's doing the cooking, there's a lot of other tasks like cleaning, taking care of children, etc. Right? All of those types of knowledge and information is just equally valuable. Right? And you'd want to be careful and responsible in designing trials once you've taken into account multiple types of data, like both ethnographic as well as large sample statistical data.
Yeah. We have a few minutes left, and I'd like to ask you about the masking trial in Bangladesh. So you mentioned, you said the only evidence we have about masking from Bangladesh, which was, of course, your study, along with many co-authors. And, in the last couple of months, masks have been in the news again because there were the Cochrane reviews released a couple of papers that said, we've reviewed the evidence and masks don't work. And there's been some back and forth on that. Can you give us a little bit of an update on where we are with that and your take on that?
Sure. Okay. So I think it is important to explain exactly why the Cochrane review made that claim. And since, the bottom line is that they have since backtracked that claim. In fact, in a conversation with Zeynep Tufekci in the New York Times, the head of the Cochrane Review basically apologized and said that we should not have written, we did not have the data to write what we wrote about math not working. But it's important to sort of take stock of exactly why that mistake happened, right? So the way to think about math research is like there's three types of research. So one is like if I can do a laboratory research where I actually put a barrier on somebody's face, right? Or on something, it doesn't even have to be a human, right? I just put a barrier on something and then I shoot particles and I see how much of that gets through, right? Okay, so those types of laboratory-based studies, they actually show math work because it's like a physics study. And as long as your filtration efficiency is high enough, they work, right? Now, but of course, the problem with those laboratory studies is that they're not in the real world, right? People may not be wearing their mask properly, etc. You really like to get field-based evidence that they work, right? So that requires, so now think about if you were to design a field study, what you'd have to do, you'd have to first get people to wear masks because you obviously, for ethical reasons, cannot glue masks on their face, right? And then once you get them to wear masks, if you succeed in that first stage, right? Only then will you have the statistical power to study the second stage on whether that mask does anything for improvements in public health, reduction in transmission, right? Now, essentially what happens with these studies is that most of them fail at the first stage. So this is actually a good place to go back to your original set of comments, Anna, right? Which is that like the Green Revolution, that was a big technological breakthrough, right? But beyond that, there's also an important social science question of how do we get people to adopt the technology, because that big technological breakthrough is only useful to the extent that the technology is actually used, right? It's the same thing with masks, right? So our study in Bangladesh, right? The reason, we had to have a really large study. It was a trial involving 350,000 people, and we were collecting blood samples. But because our second stage of like seeing whether masks work required that large sample size, that allowed us to go nuts on like trying out many different strategies to get people to wear masks. And we tried out like 20 to 30 different strategies. And it turns out there was only 4 things that really mattered a lot, in that it tripled mask use and it remained the mask usage remained persistent. And that's what allowed us, given that we had that big first stage increase from 12% mask wearing to 45% mask wearing, that allowed us to study whether masks work. Most of these studies, they fail at the first stage. And when you fail at the first stage, of course, you're not going to see any effect on the second stage. And the Cochrane Review people, I think because there's not enough social science representation there, it's much more biomedical, right? I think they did not fully appreciate that importance of the first stage. And so it came down to simple things like this, going back to ethnography, right? Yeah. So simple things like, that data, that study reports that there was some mask wearing, but where did that report come from? It was self-reported. It turns out there's another study that compared sort of like direct observation, more ethnographic style research to large sample, like self-report, and mask wearing rates are 900% higher in the self-report than in reality. So that explains where the review goes wrong.
Super interesting. I wish we could keep talking. It's been a really interesting conversation. And thank you so much for joining us to celebrate our centennial, to tell us about your work.
Oh, thank you for having me.
And
This is fun.
yeah, yeah. And I hope that you stay in touch with the SSRC.
Absolutely.
Great. All right. Thanks everyone for joining us. Take care. Have a good day.
Oh, hey, Jason, I'm giving a talk. I'll be here.